right, now we're going to move on to have the other driving force behind this project, Assistant Professor, Dr. Robert Weide. He's going to be giving a lecture on competing theoretical formats for engaging in the rehabilitation and intervention work.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming. I'm going to bore you for about a half an hour with a lecture on competing theoretical frameworks. The reason for this lecture is you're going to see a lot of people come and speak today that have experiences either as gang members or as formerly incarcerated people. And hearing these stories is one thing, but having a theoretical framework to make sense of these people's lives and what they face, and more importantly, how can we help people who are coming back from a carceral experience or who are have experience in street gangs to join us in society. So first I'm going to start with what's essentially the hegemonic model in our country and most of the Western world, which is the desistance model. Most researchers and practitioners in the United States and Europe assume that there is only one model to address gang problems and recidivism. This is the desistance model, which is essentially to get gang members to leave gangs, to get criminals to stop being criminals. This is a model that is based on a seemingly common sense logic, that gangs are bad, criminals are bad people, therefore we must strive to convince people, to cajole them, to encourage them, to support them in leaving gangs and assuming a law-abiding lifestyle. This is by far the most popular strategy for dealing with gangs and crime in the US and in Europe. This model has been exported across the world by US law enforcement authorities. However, this logic ignores the historical and structural context that produces the marginalization that gang members and criminals are a response to, thereby absolving society, the rest of us, of any responsibility for our role in creating the circumstances that lead to young people creating and joining gangs and getting involved in a criminal lifestyle in the first place. Based on pathological perception of gang members and criminals, rooted in positivistic analyses of gangs and crime, these type of perspectives seek a general solution to crime, as if we can somehow clap our hands and the problem will go away. People will stop being criminals, stop being gang members, and will join us in the good life. We need to keep in mind that this perspective is rooted in colonial practices, perspectives, and the evangelical missionary tradition here in North America, which essentially is people coming from one culture, looking at people in another culture and assuming that there's something the matter with their culture. All right, now I'm going to expand on that a little bit as we go along. I'm going to go through what are basically the primary theoretical foundations for the desistance model. The first of which is social disorganization theory. For those of you who've taken sociology classes, I don't know if how many of you have taken my criminology class. This is one of the oldest and kind of one of the original theoretical frameworks for understanding crime. It comes out of the University of Chicago in the early 20th century. And according to this perspective, crime occurs where there's a breakdown in social organization as a result of immigration, heterogeneity, and the loosening of gender roles. Now, if you blame crime on immigrants, people of color, and women, essentially what kind of perspective are you representing, right? It's obviously a very conservative, reactionary perspective that, if you think about it, is xenophobic, racist, and misogynist in blaming our problems in society not on the circumstances that people find themselves in, but blaming it on the people themselves. Unfortunately, this perspective has become hegemonic in social sciences, particularly in my field of criminology. The idea is that gangs and criminals in general are made up of people who are outside the boundaries of the dominant society and culture, and the solution, therefore, is to assimilate immigrant communities people of color, and to get women back in the kitchen, right? So that they can become a part of the mainstream American, Leave It to Beaver society that we imagine exists, but rarely does. Now, unfortunately, these perspectives were created by people who didn't exactly have a very multicultural understanding of the society that they lived in. They're based on research that was done almost exclusively by white men who lived in very privileged circumstances and who would enter communities like those we grew up in and see disorder all around them. Now, for those of you that grew up in the communities that we grew up in, we know that it isn't disorder that was going on, it was just a different type of order. But unfortunately, people who are in a position of power can go into our communities and define what's going on in our own lives. The second theoretical foundation that I'm going to discuss came around in the post-World War II period, and essentially argues that the cultures of immigrants, people of color, and poor people are inferior to the culture of dominant white society. This is the theory of deviant subcultures. According to these perspectives, the moral values of lower class cultures are different, if not the complete opposite, of mainstream moral standards. The lack of mainstream moral standards inhibits opportunities for immigrants, people of color, and poor people by causing them to value deviant roles in society over conventional roles. Basically, what this is saying is that people of color, people who grew up in working class neighborhoods, people from immigrant communities have the wrong values. And that in order to solve their problems, in order to get them away from a life of crime, that we need to inculcate them with the values of the dominant white society. Essentially, this is a form of blaming the victim, right? It conveniently puts the blame on those who suffer at the bottom of the social status hierarchy for their own predicament, while absolving the mainstream society for the role we've all played in creating the marginalization and lack of opportunity that immigrants, people of color, and the working class face. Third is social control theory. Many of you know this by the popular publication Broken Windows. Anyone here ever heard that term before? Broken Windows? Not in rehabilitation? You guys gotta take my class. This perspective is that criminality is the result. Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe you should skip ahead a few slides.
Which one?
That. Social control.
Okay.
Let me skip to a new one. I'll give you a. Sorry, I thought you were following. So you guys missed a few slides, sorry. Social control theory argues that criminality is due to a lack of self-control on the part of people who are involved in crime, and a lack of social control on the part of society, right? So essentially what this argues is that people who commit crimes are somehow pathologically different than the rest of us. And that the solution to this is to get them individually to give up their bad behavior and instead to practice good behavior and be good citizens. This is kind of the dominant perspective now when you think about reintegration efforts and rehabilitation of formerly incarcerated people and gang members, is essentially to try and figure out what's the matter with them individually. What's the matter with you as a person? What's the matter with your psychology? What's the matter with your upbringing, with your values, right? With the people that you hang out with, right? And it basically puts all of the blame on the individual, which of course absolves society of the role that society has played in creating the circumstances that people's behavior responds to. And of course the solutions are very, very similar to the others, which is to assimilate people and provide controls in the lives of individual criminals and gang members in order to regulate their personal behavior by giving them something to lose. The societal version of this is what we've become very familiar with, which is suppression policing tactics, right? Increasing law enforcement resources and law enforcement attention on relatively minor crimes in order to dominate communities and suppress crime, as if crime could magically vanish if we just throw enough resources and enough guns at it, right? Unfortunately, this perspective doesn't just pathologize individuals who are involved in crime, but also pathologizes the entire communities that marginalized, criminalized populations come from. It blames criminality on problems in individuals and problems in communities instead of on problems that are created by the larger society. It also, unfortunately, provides the justification for the selective enforcement and the targeting of marginalized communities rather than addressing the social problems that lead to these situations in the first place. Finally, I'll talk about a more liberal theoretical perspective, what we think of as being a more progressive response to the previous three that I just discussed, and that's social reproduction theory. Basically, this perspective is that gangs are inherently criminogenic organizations, that the purpose of a gang is to commit crimes. And the reason that people join gangs, the reason people get involved in crime, is because they're bad people and they're getting involved with bad groups. It's kind of the old thing, be careful who you hang out with, because if you hang out with 10 bank robbers, you'll end up being the 11th, right? Now, some faculty members, including some mentors of mine at other universities, have pointed out that assuming that gangs are inherently criminogenic and that certain communities are inherently criminal, that when young people involve themselves in these communities and these groups, that they unconsciously reproduce the conditions that result in their continued marginalization. What does that mean? By being involved in crime and getting involved in gangs and going to jail and so forth, people provide law enforcement with the justification they need in order to practice those suppression tactics that I just talked about. Now, this seems like a progressive perspective in that it doesn't necessarily, it blames, how do I want to say this? It points out to people who are involved in gangs and crime that they don't have to be that way, that they can instead choose a different type of lifestyle, right? But it also, in a way, it blames them for if they choose to be involved in gangs. If people choose to maintain a connection to their gangs, to people in their community that are involved in a criminal lifestyle, that it puts the onus on them to make a change in their lives, and basically encourages them to cut off people that they grew up with, to cut off people that they've known their whole lives, people who've been part of their support network for their whole life, call it a gang or families and communities, and encourages people to cut off everyone that they've had in their life, their whole life, with the hope that mainstream society will accept them and they'll be able to live a square life separate from the life that they've known up until that point. Right? So in a way, it blames gang members for their failure to assimilate into mainstream expectations. And unfortunately also, let me switch this on. It also leaves intact all of the negative circumstances and conditions that lead to crime in the first place, right? We can save individual gang members and we can take individual people who've been incarcerated and lead them into mainstream society, but of course that leaves intact the gangs and all of the criminal subcultures and all of the negative aspects that lead other people to engage in crime. Programs and practices that are based on this desistance model, either consciously or unconsciously, are designed around a strategy of encouraging and facilitating individual gang members and desistance from crime, from gangs, and criminals' desistance from crime. Right? So we hear these common catchphrases like gang exit, leaving the gang disengagement, crime prevention, gang desistance, reducing recidivism, right? And what do all of these terms connotate, right? What's the connotation is that in order to live a square life, in order to not be criminalized, you have to change yourself, right? You have to remove yourself from the circumstances, from the groups, from the people in the communities that you're a part of And if you don't do that, you won't be given the opportunity to make a better life for yourself. Right? So it assigns responsibility for negative behavior on individual people rather than on society as a whole. It's characterized by a focus on psychology, spirituality, and work ethic, as if people who are in gangs and people who've been involved in crime don't have these things. Right? It assumes that they're inherently criminogenic, rather than on coping strategies for gang members and criminals to employ in order to survive in the racist, classist, sexist, xenophobic society that we live in. Now, some examples of this from some of the groups that we'll be hearing from today are, for example, in Homeboy Industries. Homeboy Industries encourages gang members to use religion to take personal and also psychological treatment, to take personal responsibility for their behavior rather than accept that the marginalized circumstances they've grown up in have led to the circumstances that they find themselves in. Another group we'll be talking about, we'll be hearing from, Second Call, teaches that in order to be employed in the mainstream economy, people have to learn submissiveness. That submissiveness becomes a desired trait. You have to, walk and talk like a gaba, right? You have to pander to the cultural expectations of people who would employ you. And if you don't, well then you won't be given the opportunity to make a better life for yourself. Another group we'll be hearing from today is the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, which requires of all of its members that they renounce gang membership. Right? You have to cut off everyone you've known in your life up until that point, the entire support network that you have in your community. You have to cut that off completely, turn your back on them in order to get the chance of getting an opportunity to make a better life for yourself. Right? Now let me talk about an alternative theoretical framework for understanding gangs and criminality. The transformational model. Instead of getting gang members and criminals to individually leave gangs and desist from crime, we should work with gang members and gang leaders to transform gangs into positive social organizations focused on confronting inequality and injustice in society and in their communities. Instead of asking what is, instead of looking at the crimes that people are currently involved in, we need to ask what could be. Now there's a great deal of research that supports this perspective on gangs as resistance identities. I won't go into that in too much detail here. You can hear about it in my classes. But here's some of the citations for it. My mentor, David Brotherton, and one of his students in Italy wrote a dissertation on the Latin kings in Spain. And there's been a lot of, this isn't just a theory, it's in practice. You'll see aspects of it from our speakers here today. And we've also seen aspects of it in programs in other countries to address gang violence and gang conflict. Now the foundations of the transformational model is the perspective that gangs are an indigenous form of social organization that can either take on negative or positive roles in their communities. So we reject that gangs and that criminals are inherently bad people, right? We recognize that the term gang itself is a negativistic term that's intended to demonize and criminalize marginalized populations. And if you look at the terms that gang members use themselves to refer to themselves, they rarely use the term gang because they recognize that the term gang itself is a loaded term. It's a negativistic term, right? So among 1% motorcycle clubs, so-called motorcycle gangs, you will not find anyone in these groups referring to themselves as gang members. In fact, in case you do, everyone will stop and be like, did someone use the G word? Right? Shh. Right? We're a club. We're a motorcycle club, right? If you look at African American gangs here in Los Angeles, you'll rarely hear people refer to them as gangs. Commonly, people refer to them as communities. And when we hear from people today, some of the speakers that I'll be presenting, they'll be talking about gangs, but they won't say the word gang. They will say the word communities, people from this community or people from that community. In the Latino community, right, people also rarely use the term gang. We use the terms barrio or neighborhood, right? And in other parts of the country, in Chicago, people use the term nations. And I found in Europe, people use the term family, right? Now it's important to recognize that gang members reject this term gang as a negativistic term and instead use words that connotate a community context, right? And that's what this transformational model is really getting at, which is getting individual gang members. The problem is that getting individual gang members to desist leaves all of the negative aspects of these groups intact. Instead, we should work with gang members and gang leaders on their own terms to steer gangs from negative activities to positive activities so that they can become agents of positive social change in their own communities on their own terms. The transformational model advocates solutions specifically tailored to specific gangs and specific circumstances and specific contexts based on their own unique concerns, needs, and experiences. Now this perspective is grounded in direct ethnographic contact, interaction, and communication with active gang members and criminals. Right? You can't find out what people's perspectives are and what people's needs are if you don't talk to them and involve them in the process. Right? This is essentially an anti-colonial project. Right? Instead of privileging the perspectives of people at the top of the social stratification hierarchy, we privilege intermediaries with indigenous connections to marginalized communities. We want to interact and communicate with gang members on their own terms, in their own language, in their own culture, with their own people. Right? Instead of telling people that they need to change their culture, they need to change their behavior, they need to change their community, we respect marginalized communities, indigenous cultures, practices, and perspectives, and try and incorporate them into positive change. Now, what does this mean in practice? Right? It's what we call focused intervention. What is it that, where should law enforcement resources be focused? Right? Law enforcement resources should be focused on addressing serious crimes that threaten the entire community. Interpersonal and intergroup violence, robbery, and hard drug use. Right? We need to reason with gang members in terms that make sense to their own specific gang politics. Telling people that they have to be good and stop being bad is not helpful. Right? It doesn't speak to the experiences and the perspectives of people who are involved in crime in the first place. Right? At the same time, we need to do something that seems almost unthinkable in this context that we find ourselves in, which is disregarding minor crimes that do not threaten the community. Things like smoking marijuana, drinking alcohol, graffiti, shoplifting, these type of minor crimes that our current criminal justice system has focused on and seized on in order to criminalize people really do not create the type of threats to our community that the type of gang violence we see does. We need to make a choice as to where we focus our resources and attention. Do we focus it on serious crimes or on minor crimes? Right? In fact, enforcing the law vigorously on minor crimes has the opposite effect that it's intended. Harassing gang members and criminals for minor crimes ostracizes them and prevents engagement with them on more important issues like stopping violence from occurring. So what are the solutions that we propose? Thinking the unthinkable in a way, right? One is that we should be encouraging and facilitating the structure of gangs instead of dismantling the structure of gangs. Right? Most of our law enforcement policy currently is focused on cutting the head off the snake. Right? Focusing on going after gang leaders, prosecuting them to the fullest extent of the law, putting them in prison forever, right? And miraculously the problem will be solved. Right? Not so easy. Instead, I proposed a theory of structural disorganization, which suggests that when we do this, when we cut the head off the state, when we undermine the structure of criminal organizations, in fact, what we see is an increase in violence, not a decrease in violence. Where criminal gang structures and the structure of the criminal underworld is more robust, we see a reduction in violence. Right? Now, my research in prisons has proven this to be the case. Probably one of the biggest boogeymen we have, in this state at least, is the Mexican mafia. Ooh, scary. Right? And they're basically the go-to boogeyman for law enforcement to blame all of our problems and all of our gangs and so forth on. Right? Well, my research has actually proved that since the Mexican mafia achieved hegemony in the California prison system, the rate of serious violence, of weapon violence in California prisons plummeted. The peak year of weapon violence in California prisons was in 1993. The year that we're told that the Mexican mafia had meetings all over California, exerting their control over our communities and so forth. Well, what's been the result of that? Has the violence in your communities increased since 1993, or has it decreased? Right? We now have the lowest levels of homicide here in Los Angeles and the California prison system than we ever have in recent memory in this state. And the Mexican mafia is more powerful than it ever has been. Now let's think about it from the other direction, right? Many of you are familiar with Mexico, I hope. Right? And what's been going on in Mexico in the last 10 years? Why hasn't we teach young people in these communities to resist their continued criminalization and marginalization? And if you're interested in these, in the ideas that I've talked about today, I suggest this book by my mentor, David Brotherton, which goes into a lot more detail than I have right now. Thank you.